Welcome, my friends, to a new episode of CELTA Insider. And in this episode, we're going to talk about one of the most important CELTA criteria. We're going to talk about timing. And timing is part of what we call lesson planning. So let's see how we're supposed to be timing our lesson plans. Right. And in this episode, I'll try to be as practical as possible. So I'm going to focus on lessons that would last for 45 minutes, because this is actually how most CELTA tutors plan TPs for candidates. Actually, most TPs are for 45 minutes. So let's just start first by talking about what we mean exactly by timing. Let's see. And okay, so timing according to the CELTA criteria is allocating appropriate timing for the right stages in your lesson plan. So when you plan your lesson, you have different stages. Now the question is, how are you going to time each stage? And again, as I said, I'll be talking about lessons that would last for 45 minutes. So let's first start by language lessons. And I'm going to talk about the most famous 3 frameworks for teaching language on a CELTA course. And when I say language, I mean by this grammar, vocabulary, function. Right, so let's just start with the TTT framework. So let's talk about the TTT framework. And actually the TTT framework starts with a leading. And usually, okay, don't give your leading stage more than 5 minutes. Okay, because if you give more than 5 minutes to the leading stage, that would affect the other stages. Right, good. Then we move to the first test. And my recommendation would be, and what I'm talking about here is my personal recommendation. Again, these recommendations can be changed based on the lesson you're dealing with or the course book you're dealing with. But these would be my personal recommendations. I would say I would give 10 minutes for the first test, right? And when I say 10 minutes for the first test, of course, I'll give time for students to work alone and then to compare, and then time also for feedback. And usually the feedback for the first test is a kind of a quick feedback, because you're not going to explain, because explanation happens in the following stage, which is the teach stage. And that's why I would give the teach stage 5 minutes. And someone might say, Shadi, come on, for God's sake, that's the main aim. Would you give it 5 minutes? I would say, yeah, usually try not to talk much when you're explaining your target language, and try to make sure that you would be able to deliver meaning, pronunciation, and form of your target language in 5 minutes. And if that becomes like kind of too much, then it can be 7 or 8 minutes, but not more than that, right? Why? Because we want to leave a lot of time for the practice part. And the practice part would come in the following stage, which is the second test. And that's why when we look at the second test, you will notice that I gave it 20 minutes. And someone might say, Shadi, 20 minutes? I'd say, yeah, because the second test is for control practice and freer practice. And imagine that you've got a couple of control practice in your course book. So you're going to give each one 5 minutes here, 5 minutes there, 10 minutes for the freer practice, fair enough, you know. So 20 minutes will be fine. And then we come to the feedback stage. And that feedback stage would be for the content and language feedback on the freer practice in the second test. Not the whole stage, but the freer practice in this stage. And I would say give it 5 minutes. So that's how you would deal with the TTT framework. And that's, again, as I said, it's my personal recommendation. I'm not talking about, you know, scientific rules here. I'm not saying that it is what it is and you can't change that. No, all this can be changed depending on the course book, depending on the part you want to focus more on it. And of course you would need to discuss that with your tutor on a CELTA course in the assisted lesson planning. Right, good. Now let's move to the PPP framework, present, practice, produce. And again, in present, practice, produce, we start with a leading, 5 minutes again. And then after that, you move to the presenter stage. And in the presenter stage, this is when you clarify language. Give it 5 minutes, as we said. We don't love it when language explanation, goes over the limits. No. We want you, yes, to clarify meaning, pronunciation, and form, but, in a good way. Like, don't take too much time doing that, because don't turn it into a kind of traditional teaching here. Right. Well, after the presenter stage, you go to the practicer stage. And in the practicer stage, you can spend 15 minutes. Why? Because the practicer stage is for control practice. Maybe you might have 2 activities, 7 and 7 minutes, maybe 3 activities, 5, 5, 5. So it depends on the course book. And then after that, you go to the producer stage. And in the producer stage, give it 15 minutes, maybe a couple of freer practice, or maybe one long freer practice, or maybe you've got only one and it wouldn't take much time, and you will take this 5 minutes and give it to the practice stage. So you end up having 20 minutes for the practice stage. It's up to you. As I said, this kind of timing is just to give you a point of view of what you need to do. It's not giving you rules or anything, but just, use what I'm saying here as a kind of a guideline for you, so that you imagine how we think about these stages. And then we come to the final stage, which is feedback, and you can give it 5 minutes here. Lovely. Now let's move to text-based presentation. Now, text-based presentation is more difficult when it comes to timing than the previous 2 frameworks, because in text-based presentations we've got more stages, and sometimes it becomes confusing for CELTA candidates. So let's say first, lead in 5 minutes, end of a story. We know that already. Good, lovely. Then we move after that to exposure, and usually in the exposure stage, the students read a text and answer some questions, and most of the time it's a gist question. It's a question about the main idea. So my recommendation here would be, for the exposure stage, give your students 7 minutes. And then after that we move to highlighting, which is a very important stage where students highlight the target language in the text. And I would say you can give this a stage kind of 7 minutes again, right? Good, lovely. And then after that we come to the language explanation or language clarification, and give it 5 minutes as usual, right? And then after that we come to the practice stage. And the practice stage here covers control practice and freer practice. And you can give this a stage 15 minutes, as I said, because you might have about 3 activities there, like 2 controlled and 1 free. And then finally you come to the feedback stage, where you will give it 5 minutes. Then after that we move to the receptive skills framework. And when I say receptive skills, I'm talking here about reading and listening. So let's talk about these. Let's have a look at these frameworks. And usually the pre-reading or listening stage is a bit complicated, because sometimes it's just leading and then you move to the reading or listening stage. Sometimes you've got, many stages inside the pre-reading stage, like you might have leading and then prediction and then pre-teaching vocabulary. So again, this would take more time. So again, in my recommendation here, I imagine that you have all this, because this is what is more difficult, right? I imagine that we have so many stages now, and we want to think about them. So I would say for leading, again, 5 minutes as usual. And then after that, you come to pre-teaching vocabulary. I would say give it 5 minutes, right? Because it has to be done quickly here, because it's not the main focus. And then after that, you come to the prediction stage. And this can be finished as well in 5 minutes. Then after the pre-reading stage is over, you can move to the reading, the while reading and listening stage. And in the while reading and listening stage, sometimes you have only 2 reading activities or 2 listening activities. Sometimes you have 3 reading or listening activities. Then you need to be careful. So I said for reading and listening 1, give it 7 minutes. For reading and listening 2, 7 minutes. For reading and listening 3, 7 minutes. Right? Why? Because that is your main aim. You need to make sure that the students have enough time to read and listen. Right? And sometimes they will ask you to play the track again, to listen one more time, and you need to respond to the needs. So you need to be careful with timing here. And then we come finally to the last stage, which is what we call the post-reading or post-listening. And it can be one of 3 things. It can be speaking, it can be text analysis, it can be writing. And in all this, try to give it 9 minutes. And all in all, you will have a 45-minute lesson. Now let's move to writing. And in writing, we're going to talk about the product approach. In the product approach, you start with leading, again, 5 minutes, no more. And then you move from leading to reading, because the students need to read a model so that they can produce a model like it by the end of the lesson. And I would say, give that part here 5 minutes, no more. And then move from that to genre analysis. And genre analysis is a very important stage in the product approach, is because genre analysis is when the teacher starts explaining the genre, content, lexis, layout, organization, grammar, style. Again, yes, of course, it's impossible for the teacher to focus on all that, and it's not practical, yeah, I know, right? But again, maybe the teacher would choose only one area, maybe a couple of areas, that kind of stuff, right? And then after genre analysis, we'll move to the stage of writing. And writing takes a lot of time, so give your students 15 minutes to write. And then after you give them 15 minutes to write, you give them 5 minutes for feedback, right? So you give them kind of content feedback. Maybe when you're monitoring, you might pick up a couple of mistakes, and then you put them later in the feedback stage on the board, and you discuss that, fine. So you cover content and language feedback, fair enough, right? So someone might say, Shadi, what if my students finish the written task, before the 15 minutes are over? Good. I mean, that would be great, because that would give you more time for feedback. So you can move that time, this extra time, to the feedback stage and run a wonderful feedback stage on content and language. Okay, cool. Now let's move to writing again, but this time the process approach. And again, the process approach, you start with leading, and leading again, give it 5 minutes. Wonderful, lovely. And then, my friend, move from leading to draft, and you can give 15 minutes for the draft stage, because this is a stage when the students will start actually writing. Okay, right. And then genre analysis, this is when you will do your job as a teacher, so you can give that a stage 10 minutes, right? And then after genre analysis, the students would want to edit what they have produced previously, and this is why you can give them 10 minutes to work on their piece of writing and adapt it and make it better. And then finally you move to the feedback stage, and you can give that 5 minutes as well. Now let's move to speaking. How to time the speaking framework. And again, first leading, give it 5 minutes as well, right? So 5 minutes for the leading stage. Then we move to the preparation stage, where students would need to either listen or read in order to be prepared to talk about the topic. And you can give them, for this stage, 10 minutes, okay? Right, after that you move to useful language, and this stage is about the languages students would need during the speaking task. And you can give that stage also 10 minutes. Then you come to the actual speaking task, give the students 15 minutes, right? And then finally we come to feedback, 5 minutes as well. Right, again, my friends, as I said, in this video, I'm not giving you rules that you should follow every time you're teaching. I'm giving you some recommendations that would apply to many lessons, but not all of them. So you would need to change that all the time, depending on the type of the lesson you're facing, right, or the kind of material you're dealing with. Because sometimes you would see that there are a lot of control practice here, maybe a shorter, freer practice there, maybe a longer preparation stage, a shorter genre analysis stage. Things change all the time in course books, but I wanted to give you an example of how we think about timing when we are planning, right, our lessons. And I hope that this would help you when you're planning your lessons, and will give you an idea of how we think about timing. Thank you so much for watching this episode of CELTA Insider. Until we meet again, this was Shadi Abu Yusuf. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.